The late afternoon sun settled over Chicago, painting the tall buildings with warm gold as the city kept moving to its usual rhythm. People hurried across the sidewalks, horns echoed from distant avenues, and the rush of daily life continued without pause. In the middle of that movement walked a 10-year-old boy named Dylan Carter, carrying a worn backpack and a half-empty bottle of fruit drink. He had just finished running an errand for his mother and was heading home, thinking about the leftovers waiting in their small apartment on the west side. Dylan was used to traveling through the crowded streets alone, careful, quiet, unnoticed. He was a small kid with a big sense of responsibility, something life had taught him early. As he walked along Michigan Avenue, something caught his attention. On the stone edge of the sidewalk, partially hidden by the shadows of a bus stop, lay a girl, pale and still. People walked past her as if she were a discarded bag, barely glancing down before continuing their rush. Dylan slowed, his heart beginning to pound. He had seen many people ignored on the streets before, but something about the stillness of this girl made a knot twist inside his stomach. She looked young, just a little older than him, maybe 14 or 15, with long blonde hair that fell over her face and a backpack beside her. He hesitated. Adults usually told kids like him to mind their business, to keep moving, to avoid trouble. But he could not convince his feet to step away. He approached carefully and knelt beside her. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, her lips losing color. Dylan felt a cold wave of panic creep up his spine. He whispered to himself, remembering the little he had seen on television in school safety videos. He gently tilted her head back, trying to keep her airway open. It was the only thing he could think to do. Around him, the city kept passing by. A pair of businessmen looked at him and shook their heads, assuming the worst. Others murmured that she was probably another young person who had taken something she shouldn't have. Dylan wanted to shout that they were wrong, but his voice stayed silent. He looked down and noticed a phone beside her. The screen cracked but still lit. A missed call flashed on the screen and one name stood out clearly: Dad. Dylan stared at the screen. His shake shook. Should he call? Would anyone even believe him? He looked around again. No one else had stopped. He took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and pressed the number. The ringing seemed to echo forever. When the voice answered, deep and impatient, Dylan froze. He swallowed hard and forced his words out, his young voice trembling. "Sir, your daughter is on the ground on Michigan Avenue. She is not waking up. She needs help." There was a long pause on the other end, filled with suspicion. The man asked if this was some kind of trick. Dylan almost ended the call, but he looked down at the girl and stayed. "I am not lying," he said softly. "Please come. She needs you." The voice changed slightly, less harsh, more focused. The man asked for the exact location and Dylan quickly gave the cross streets, speaking as clearly as he could. When the call ended, Dylan sat beside the girl, keeping her head tilted, feeling small and scared, but refusing to leave. The people passing by whispered again, but their words no longer mattered. Dylan stayed with her, watching her faint breathing, hoping he had done the right thing. In the distance, he began to hear the faint sound of a car engine moving fast through the city streets. The sound grew louder, sharper, and he prepared himself for whatever would come next. Dylan wished his mother were there. She always told him that doing the right thing often meant standing alone, even when others doubted you. Their neighborhood was not easy, but she worked long hours at a local diner and still found time to teach him kindness, patience, and the belief that every life mattered. He remembered the evenings they spent looking out the small kitchen window, watching the trains pass. Dylan did not have much, but he had heart, and that guided him now. He looked at the girl again, noticing how fragile she appeared in the fading light. He spoke softly, hoping she could somehow hear him, telling her that help was coming and she was not alone. The city traffic hummed, the sky began to darken, and Dylan held his position, determined to stay until someone who loved her arrived. The black luxury sedan cut through traffic with precise urgency. its engine roaring as it turned sharply off the main avenue and rolled to the curb. Doors opened before the car had fully stopped, and two men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the street with sharp, focused eyes. People nearby slowed their steps, recognizing authority and wealth even before understanding what was happening. Then the rear door opened, and a tall, well-dressed man emerged. His name was Richard Callahan, one of the most influential businessmen in Chicago, known for building companies that stretched across the entire country. His presence alone altered the air around him. He looked like a man who always knew where he was going, what he needed, and how to command a room. Until now. Richard's eyes landed on the small boy kneeling beside Emily, and his heart lurched with fear. For a moment, suspicion hardened his expression. He was used to deception. He had experienced false emergencies, threats, and scams that targeted his family, and seeing his daughter vulnerable in the hands of a stranger awakened every defensive instinct he carried. Dylan looked up at him, holding the phone out with trembling fingers. "I did not hurt her," he whispered. "I just stayed." His voice was thin but steady, and Richard paused. He dropped to the pavement beside his daughter, his guarded expression cracking when he touched her wrist and felt the faint pulse. "Emily," he breathed. The powerful tone he carried in boardrooms was gone. He spoke as a father filled with fear. The paramedics arrived moments later, pushing through the murmuring crowd. They examined Emily quickly, checking vitals, stabilizing her, and preparing her for transport. One of the paramedics looked at Dylan with approval and spoke clearly. "Good job, kid. She could have lost her airway. You kept her safe." Richard froze at those words. He stood and looked at Dylan deeply, seeing something he had not expected. A child who stayed when every adult walked away. The medics lifted Emily onto the stretcher and rushed her toward the ambulance. Richard followed, his hand hovering close but unable to touch her until the paramedics gave permission. When he looked back, his eyes met Dylan's again. For the first time in years, he did not know what to say. The ambulance doors closed, and sirens began to scream through the evening streets. Before leaving, Richard told one of his security team to bring Dylan along. The boy hesitated, unsure, but climbed into the second vehicle. As they sped toward the hospital, Dylan stared out the window, watching Chicago's tall skyline blur past, unsure whether he had done enough or if he was somehow in trouble. At the hospital, bright lights and polished floors surrounded them with brisk efficiency. Richard paced back and forth, tension visible in every line of his body. He was used to controlling outcomes, but now he waited helplessly behind guarded doors while doctors worked to stabilize his daughter. Dylan sat in a plastic chair near the wall, his feet not touching the floor, his backpack on his lap. He did not speak. He did not fidget. He simply waited, the weight of the moment sinking slowly in his young heart. Across the waiting room, two nurses whispered near the vending machine. "That's him, right? The billionaire?" "The boy found her," they said. "Funny how fate works." Dylan lowered his eyes, feeling suddenly too small. He did not know whether he belonged here, whether anyone wanted him, or whether he should slip quietly away. But he stayed, because leaving felt wrong. After what felt like hours, a doctor finally pushed through the double doors. Richard rushed forward. "How is she?" he demanded, voice strained. The doctor's expression softened. "She is stable," he said. "Whoever kept her airway open until we got there prevented this from becoming much worse." Richard turned slowly toward Dylan. The truth settled like a weight across his chest. This boy had done what countless adults had ignored. Richard approached him. Dylan sat straighter, bracing himself. "I just did not want her to be alone," he whispered. The words broke something in Richard that he did not realize still existed. Pride, fear, and judgment fell away, replaced by humility. He sat beside Dylan, both facing the closed doors, waiting together. No words were needed. When Emily was finally wheeled out, still pale but conscious, Richard felt tears threaten the corners of his eyes. She blinked weakly, her gaze searching, until it landed on him. She whispered something that only he could hear, and he rested his hand gently on hers. Then, when he looked back toward Dylan, he saw the boy trying to slip away unnoticed. Richard stood, stopping him with a quiet voice that carried the weight of truth. "You saved her life." He knelt to Dylan's level, a gesture that shocked everyone watching, and said words the boy would never forget. "You will never be forgotten." Dylan blinked, overwhelmed, unsure whether to smile or cry. Reporters and witnesses looked on in disbelief. Two lives that began in different worlds had collided in a moment of crisis, bound by the simple courage of a child who refused to walk past someone in need. Emily was alive. The city outside kept moving, unaware that something extraordinary had just shifted in the hearts of two strangers. And as the doors to the elevator closed, the boy who had nothing but compassion found himself stepping into a story that was far from over. The night settled over Chicago with a chill that seeped into the hospital walls. Fluorescent lights hummed above the waiting room, illuminating faded chairs, tired patients, and workers moving from hallway to hallway with practiced urgency. Dylan sat alone now, his small body sinking into the oversized chair as the events of the evening weighed down on him. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by exhaustion and uncertainty. He had never imagined that a simple trip home would lead him into a wealthy world that felt distant and intimidating. He wondered whether he should leave quietly before anyone changed their mind about him being there, but something held him in place. Maybe he needed to know Emily would truly be safe. Richard stood outside Emily's temporary room, staring through the small window in the door. His daughter rested with tubes and monitors surrounding her, a sight that tightened fear around his chest. He had spent years building businesses, attending meetings, traveling, and believing that providing the best education, house, and opportunities would protect his daughter from harm. But tonight had shattered that illusion. For the first time, he realized how fragile everything truly was. Wealth could not stop fate. Power could not prevent loss. All he could do was wait and hope. Behind him, one of his security men cleared his throat softly. "Sir, we have been monitoring news outlets. A few reporters have already picked up small pieces. Should we shut it down?" Richard shook his head slowly. "No, let it be. People should know what happened." He was a man unfamiliar with being humbled, unfamiliar with giving up the appearance of absolute control. Yet something about Dylan's courage had shifted him. He could not go back to seeing the world the same way. For a moment, he looked down the hall toward the waiting room, thinking about the small boy who had stayed when the city had turned its back. Meanwhile, Dylan stared at the vending machine, wishing he had $1 for a snack. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and the faint scent of cafeteria food drifting from somewhere he could not reach. He pulled his jacket sleeves over his hands and took a deep breath. His mother would be worried. He had no phone to call her, no way to explain the unimaginable night he had just lived. But he also knew she taught him that doing the right thing sometimes came with sacrifices. She had raised him to be brave even when afraid. Still, a knot grew in his chest. What if she thought something terrible had happened? He wondered whether the hospital had a payphone, if those still existed. He slid an inch off the seat, thinking of going to look, but stopped when footsteps approached. Richard entered the waiting room, hands in his pockets, shoulders heavy. Dylan looked up quickly, unsure whether he should stand or stay sitting. Richard gave him a tired but sincere nod. "Come with me." Dylan followed, glancing nervously between the floor and the walls filled with framed photographs of smiling donors. Richard led him into a small consultation room. Before speaking, he sat down, seeming uncertain of how to begin. Even the powerful sometimes lost their words. Dylan's heart pounded. Was he in trouble now? Richard finally spoke quietly. "I need to ask you something, Dylan. How did you know what to do out there?" Dylan swallowed, unsure how to answer. He twisted the strap of his backpack and said softly, "I saw it once on television, a show about emergencies. They tilted the head like that to help someone breathe. I just tried to copy it." His voice cracked slightly. I hoped it would work. Richard listened, astonished. A television show. No medical training, no adult guidance, but pure instinct and compassion. Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment before speaking again. Dylan, do you know how many people walked past her tonight? Richard's voice shook with emotion he rarely allowed anyone to hear. Do you know how many adults who should have known better just kept walking? Dylan lowered his eyes. I could not walk away, he whispered. She looked like she needed someone. Richard nodded slowly. He understood the weight of those words more than he ever had before. Then came the moment neither expected. The door opened and a doctor entered, eyes serious. She addressed Richard first. We need to speak. Richard stood quickly and followed, Dylan trailing behind instinctively. The doctor explained that Emily's condition was stable, but not without complications. They needed to run more tests. She had suffered a dangerous episode that could have worsened if help had not arrived exactly when it did. Richard listened intently, gratitude and fear mixing in him. When the doctor left, he remained silent for a long moment, facing the window that revealed only the dark night outside. Then came the crack in the night. A sudden alarm blared from Emily's room. Nurses rushed in. Richard felt the world tilt beneath him. Dylan froze in the doorway, heart pounding. Someone shouted for equipment. Emily's breathing had become irregular again. The room filled with tension. Richard tried to step forward but was blocked by the medical team. He stood helpless, face pale, watching monitors flash red warnings. Dylan stood behind him, clutching the doorframe. The girl he had fought to save was slipping again, and no one could do anything but watch as doctors struggled to bring her back. The moment stretched into what felt like eternity. The hospital hallway fell silent except for frantic voices behind the door. It was the lowest point, the terrifying moment when hope felt thin and fragile. No one knew whether Emily would survive the night. The alarms settled into a steady rhythm, and for a long moment, the hospital hallway remained frozen in suspense. Richard stood motionless, hands clenched into fists, staring through the small window of Emily's room, as nurses and doctors worked urgently. Dylan stayed a few steps behind, too afraid to move, his small frame tense with worry. Everything he had done, every decision he had made, had led to this moment. He wondered if he had failed her, if saving her once would not be enough. He whispered a silent plea, hoping somehow she could hear it. Inside the room, the medical staff stabilized Emily's breathing, adjusting equipment and checking her oxygen levels. The doctor finally stepped back, drawing a slow breath as the heart monitor beeped steadily. She turned to the hallway and motioned for Richard to come in. Dylan watched the man enter, shoulders tight, afraid of what he might hear. The doctor spoke quietly but clearly. She is stable again. Her episode passed. She needs rest and monitoring, but she is going to make it. Relief washed over Richard with such force that he had to lean against the bed rail for support. Emily stirred slightly, eyelids fluttering. Her father took her hand gently, whispering words that no one else could hear. When the doctor left the room, Richard motioned for Dylan to join him. The boy approached slowly, unsure whether he belonged in this sacred moment between father and daughter, but Richard placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him closer. Emily opened her eyes fully for the first time and saw Dylan. Her tired voice barely carried across the quiet room. "You stayed." Dylan swallowed hard and nodded. Emily's eyes softened with gratitude before closing again in exhaustion. Richard and Dylan stepped into the hallway, allowing Emily to rest. The man who had spent years building an empire realized how close he had come to losing everything. He had boardrooms full of people who admired him, competitors who envied him, and a fortune large enough to affect entire industries. Yet none of it had mattered in the moments he thought his daughter might slip away. A child from a completely different world had done what money could not. Richard took a deep breath and turned to Dylan. "I want to thank you properly." Dylan shook his head. You don't have to. Richard looked at him with a seriousness softened by understanding. But I do. Come with me. Dylan followed him through the corridors until they reached the hospital cafeteria, now quiet with only a few workers wiping tables. Richard bought 2 simple meals and sat across from the boy who had changed everything. Dylan ate slowly, unsure what to say. Richard began speaking, more honestly than he was accustomed to. I was not there tonight. I was in a meeting, preparing another business deal. I thought I had time. I thought I knew what mattered. Dylan listened, his eyes wide. Richard continued, You made me see something I had forgotten. That people are meant to look out for each other. That no one is too small to make a difference. He paused, gathering his thoughts. You reminded me what it means to be human. Dylan blinked, surprised by the depth of the words. He did not see himself as special. He was just a boy who did not walk away. But Richard saw more. You deserve support, opportunity, and acknowledgement, he said firmly. Dylan shifted nervously. He had never been offered anything like that. Yet Richard was sincere. I cannot erase the world's problems, but I can start by helping where I am able. He offered to assist Dylan's mother with housing, school resources, and mentorship programs, wanting not to buy gratitude, but to repay a debt of the heart. Dylan was overwhelmed and did not know how to respond. Richard sensed this and simply said, Think about it, no pressure. Later, they returned to Emily's room together. She slept peacefully now, color slowly returning to her cheeks. Richard stood beside her bed, while Dylan remained near the doorway, not wanting to intrude. The man looked back and motioned him forward. You belong here tonight. And Dylan stepped closer, realizing for the first time that this moment was not about wealth or status, but about a connection forged in crisis. Morning sunlight slowly filtered through the blinds, casting soft lines of gold across the floor. Emily awoke again and whispered a small thank you to Dylan. Her voice was weak, but her gratitude was clear. Richard watched them, seeing how extraordinary it was that 2 lives from opposite sides of the city could become intertwined in such a powerful way. A few hours later, reporters gathered outside the hospital, eager for details. Richard stepped forward to address them. Cameras clicked and microphones were raised. But his attention stayed focused on the boy beside him. This child saved my daughter's life, he said calmly. The world needs to remember that courage and compassion do not require wealth or status. Sometimes they live in the hearts of those who have nothing else to give. The crowd murmured, struck by the sincerity of the moment. Dylan looked down, cheeks warming under the attention. After the reporters dispersed, Richard knelt again, meeting Dylan at eye level. These words were not for cameras or headlines, but for the boy who had changed him. You gave me my daughter back. I will never forget that. Dylan nodded slowly, overwhelmed but proud. He was just one boy in a vast city, but he had stood still when everyone else walked away. Emily recovered fully in the days that followed. Richard stayed with her, more present and more aware than he had been in years. Dylan returned home to his mother, finally able to tell her what had happened. She listened with tears in her eyes and held him close, knowing the magnitude of what he had done. Life moved forward, but some moments never faded. A city that had rushed past a girl in need learned the power of a single act of kindness. And a wealthy man learned that heroes do not always wear suits, nor do they come with power or influence. Sometimes they walk the streets with worn shoes and quiet hearts. If this story touched you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts and follow the channel for more inspiring stories told from the heart.